I have a question to propose. While when we are celebrating Peter and Alison, not only for a question of memory, but for the actuality of their work and their thoughts. Inside this space, we celebrate a sort of Sagden House Day. I am very happy because it is a beautiful small house. But outside from here, the city celebrates another kind of architecture, enormous, higher and higher. The imagine of a continuous, progressive richness, which is not the way, the right way for the world, I think, at this moment. And so Peter said and wrote a magnificent phrase. The first duty of architecture is to the fabric of which form part, not is part, form part. And so not only the texture, but the form of town, the meaning of town, etc., etc. And I think that in the discussion of this evening, I saw a sort of private interest toward the architecture of Peter Smithson, rather than toward a largest view of the architecture and the town. In the world, strangely, and also for between the young students, there is an interest toward Peter Smithson and Alison. In the United States, has been published Charged Void and is following a second volume. Which kind of interest there is really about the work of Alison and Peter Smithson? I think that probably it is better not forgetting nothing, because their personality was very open and very enlarged in all the direction. Also, their criticism toward the town, the kind of architecture we are making. I remember in a recent, I think, interview to Peter Smithson, where he makes a criticism also toward the so loved Netherlands architecture, saying is a sort of eclecticism of 20s and 30s. I think that the ideas of the Smithsons about the town are still useful and not celebrating, but following, studying and developing.
I'm doing studies. I'm doing a PhD in this house as well as the Smithson House. And what's intrigued me is the use of color in Smithson's work. There's a lot of discussion on brutalist handling of material, best found material. But suddenly you get wondering I've been intrigued, what does colors mean to them? And I wonder if Louisa perhaps can illuminate me on if you use color in the same way that perhaps the Smithsons were interested in.
I don't think I'm really qualified to answer this question, although I have an obvious interest in colour and we use it in our work. But I know the Smithsons really enjoyed colour in the all ephemera and textiles and vernacular architecture and in life. But as I said in my talk, they didn't. It was an implication. They didn't use it so much in architecture as something applied in itself. So probably somebody who has a more academic relationship to their work can fill us in.
We all architects.
I know, but you guys spend more time studying it.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about colour. I was going to try and address this gentleman's question because I thought it was a very important point which is really about why architects of my generation are not trying to make plans for cities. Why that kind of whole area of their energy has not been kind of picked up by our generation. I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I could try, and maybe other people could join in, because I think it is an interesting debate. And I guess my generation have kind of lost the confidence to that architects have much power to make cities, and that they don't have the confidence to make proposals like the Smithsons made because of this time. I think they've been kind of disempowered, and that the only architects that you can think of who are doing interesting, effective things in that area, I guess, would be Koolhaas, and I find it ultimately nihilistic. I find it's kind of harnessing of forces. I'm not a supporter, and my reaction is, because I think it's kind of almost giving in somehow. It's trying to make something out of ultimately what I consider to be rather destructive forces. And my reaction is to kind of stand back, I suppose, and concentrate on buildings. But I'd be interested to know what other people say, because I think it's important.
Well, I mean, it's just an observation similar. I mean, the Smithsons, obviously in the late 40s, early 50s, were operating in a completely different context, post-war, etc., with all the poverty and austerity, but at the same time, the hope and the optimism of rebuilding the European cities. And I can't remember, it was a point Stefania made earlier, but with the Hauptstadt Berlin competition, which I think one of the sketches that you showed was this network over the central of Berlin, which came up in discussion earlier to do with the Smithsons' relation to history. And in this case, what I really admired, similar to Sharon's entry, was their using the fact of the bombardments of 90% total bombardment of the centre of Berlin to take it as found, literally sort of flat, and put a new structure on top and not rebuild the 19th century as they've been doing in a way for the past 10 years in the centre of Berlin. So there it was actually taking the opportunity of a new layer of history in Berlin, which has been changing obviously rapidly through the last century. I'm not quite sure where I wanted to go from there. I had one other point. It'll probably come to me someday.
But to a certain extent, I think it's also a pity that we are not thinking about the city anymore that much. And I believe it's exactly what Peter said. We are not believing in being able to design whole cities, but we think much more about strategies in the very moment. And what we actually do in Switzerland, we are in the very moment thinking an awful lot about the cities in between, which was sort of never an issue in classical architecture, we always thought about sort of nice cities, middle-aged cities in Italy, but never sort of in the so-called suburb, which is sort of very much something new. And I think there will be a whole generation sort of dealing with these things, and I think that's something which goes on and starts again, actually.
Just one historical note again. The first multi-level city that he quotes, it's actually Leonardo da Vinci's multi-level city. And he takes it from Andorra. So it's actually he takes it because it was like a conversation. Andorra was commenting their project, the Golden Lake, and then he makes the reference. He takes it as a reference.
I'd just like to pick up on the point that Peter's made. I sort of dismiss the point that you're really making. I think there are people who are thinking about the urban as having relevance to a contemporary architectural discussion. I think there was a very, very good paper that was given today that felt full of examples that we have a duty to consider. I feel that there are practices in this country who are exploring these kinds of issues, and I think they should be acknowledged. But I think you're right in as much as it does feel that for too long the urban hasn't been enough of the kind of the concern of the questioning architect, and I think the opportunity to think at a strategic level is something that is absolutely important. It's not just about making buildings and leaving them to find their own kind of sense of responsibility in the city, but I think it's about situating them. And I think you as an architect, Peter, do that as well as anyone I can think of. I think we do live in a time, though, when the mechanisms that we have to sort of negotiate with do make this very, very difficult. I don't think the city that we happen to be working in has ever lent itself to a sort of an urban understanding that you can easily grasp, and I think that's both troubling but also deeply fascinating.
I think also the education to me seems quite different in England and on the continent, and certainly in Germany, with regards to architecture and Städtebau, as you'd say in Germany. I suppose in English you'd say urbanism, but somehow it's a different thing. And I think in Germany it is actually taken on much more as part of the architect's task. I don't mean planning whole new cities, but the responsibility of a good urban solution to every scheme is often taken a priori, that you do that before you move on to the architecture. I just feel it's a big difference. Do you feel that?
But isn't it about scale of operation? The Economist building being a kind of paradigm for commercial development in the city is in fact a
piece of urbanism.
Of kind of urban and rethinking about that corner of the city, like a big corner, but not that big. Well, shall we kind of continue the conversation upstairs? Absolutely. Okay, drink. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Back to the AA. It's without question that Peter is really one of the major figures of 20th century architecture, and someone who has made enormous contribution to both thinking, writing, and building of architecture. He and Alison were responsible for really finding the so-called Team 10, which was such a crucial group of individuals responsible for rethinking so many of the premises of SIAM, the previous meetings, and the international style, through the development of an architecture that was committed to rethinking history, to rethinking place, to rethinking locality in many respects. Part of what they developed, I'm thinking specifically about, for example, the work that Peter did with Nigel Henderson in terms of the discussion of As Found and the photographs of the East End, brought something of the grittiness and the material dimension of architecture, which has been the source of so much inspiration, especially in the last 10 years or so, in the UK, in Switzerland, in Spain. So many architects have discovered the work of Peter and Alison Smithson and the work of Team 10. Their projects, specifically the Hunstanton School in Norfolk and the Economist building, have also become significant projects, both in terms of the understanding of architecture in relation to materials, but also in terms of architecture's relationship to the question of urbanity. In some ways, developing an understanding of context, which is, in my opinion, very different, for example, than what was being debated or we have since inherited from the arguments of collage city and contextualism. Tonight, Peter Smithson is going to talk specifically about the Patio and Pavilion project, which relates to the exhibition, part of the independent group's exhibition. This is tomorrow, held at the Whitechapel Gallery originally in 1956. And then again, as part of a traveling exhibition in the early 1990s, the question of the reconstruction, in a sense, of the original project and the difficulties, or what is, I suppose, some of the worries that he had to face in terms of the 1990s project reviving the Whitechapel exhibition. We are also fortunate that Peter is coming back again. He's not only here tonight, but also on Friday, the 2nd of November. He's going to be part of the conference As Found, which is going to be held here on that Friday at the AA with a number of speakers from Switzerland and other places. And it also coincides with the publication of a book by Lars Müller in Switzerland entitled As Found. Please welcome Peter Smithson.
You've already heard that of the material that I'm going to show you, that there are two versions. But I think I should talk about the origin of the first version as an introduction, whilst you get used to my voice. The Patio and Pavilion was shown at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 1956, and it began in a very odd way, and that was there was a French group called Group Espace who dealt with the integration of art and architecture in a formal sense, like kind of poor man's Van Doesburg. And they requested somebody, some English painter, to form a parallel group. And there were meetings in Charlotte Street in people's studios in which they universally decided they didn't want to have anything to do with the Group Espace, and we would do a thing on our own. And the organization was done by Theo Crosby, who was then one of the editors of architectural design, and he raised a tiny amount of money, like £300 for everybody. You know, I mean, we're talking about a very the 50s was a very difficult period here. And so this first version came about in the Whitechapel Art Gallery. Now, the theme, I suppose, of the lecture is to distinguish between the two, not so much as their content, but the way that the content worked with the light. In Whitechapel Art Gallery, I mean, you can all hear me perfectly well. In the Whitechapel Art Gallery, our pavilion was in the far right-hand corner, which had patent glazing over half of it, more or less in the manner of the courtyard below, Ching. Still called Ching's Yard? But, I mean, 50 years ago, you know, you don't know how things change. And maybe, will we have the first slide, please? The group of people was Nigel Henderson, Alison Smithson, Eduardo Palocci, and me. And this picture itself tells most of the story. You know, that is that there are 3 motor cars in the street. You can sit in the street and use the street in the old way as an arena, extension of the house. Opposite, behind Nigel is a bottle recycling depot where you took your wine bottles and they rinsed them out and resold them. You know, I mean, there's a whole ethos, a whole climate in the picture. Next, please. And the process of evolution was that a one-point perspective was made of the enclosure with the shed in it, and the way in under the hardboard on the floor with sand on the edges, so there was a root around it. And the next piece. And then for the catalogue, there was a tentative occupation of the patio and pavilion. And as you can see, it fell into the traditional role of the architect providing the framework which suggests something, but then the occupier does the rest. And by chance, am I spoiling it for you? No. By chance it worked like that. That is, the drawings were made, the working drawing for the framework, and then Alice and I went off to Dubrovnik for a Siam meeting, and when we came back, it was all done. You know, just like when you leave a house and the occupiers move in, you know, without any interference with you. So that in a curious way, it was ideological. That is, the frogs wanted a conscious participation of art and artists. What we say is, it's the spontaneous. Nobody talked to the others. You just do it. So there was a change of mode from the people who wanted to do the exhibition in the first place. Next, please. And the first 9 slides are the original 1956. Okay. And the next, please. And the next. And you can see that the aluminium-faced plywood, which was normally in that period probably used for lining of toilets, was rather dull. Therefore, the resonance between the content and the occupier was very soft. Next, please, as you can see. And you can see what I'm trying to put over pedagogically. The working of the light in the 56 version. You can see it top light because it's on the string course. Next, please. And the stuff, you walk around on blockboard, and where it wasn't the official formal walkway, it was sand. And I must say that what was nice about the 1990 Reconstruction, they asked about where the sand came from. That's wonderful. The notion of perfection. Next, please. And the collage from Nigel Henderson, and these lumps from Eduardo Palazzi, and the fragments. Next, please. Right, that's the end of the first group. Now, an American lady who was then somewhere, I've lost her name, Jacqueline Bass, who was then somewhere north of Vermont, and later at the Berkeley Art Gallery. And she wished to rebuild the Patio Pavilion and to remake the original fragments. I mean, fantastically energetic. And so some of the things were from the original, but most of the pieces were remade. So we have the first slide. Now, the second exposure was at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in the Mall, and it faces more or less south. And it still has the original shutters on the windows. And these photographs were taken on a brilliant day when the sun was hitting the building. And by manipulating the early 19th century shutters, we could control the entry of the light into the space. So you have a difference between a flat overhead light and bright sunshine, not direct, but series of reflections. I mean, this is what I want you to pay attention to. I'm actually giving a lecture now. So that, and you can see that the plywood, the aluminium faced plywood is much brighter, much more reflective. And the nature of the wood is pretty realistically like the original. Next, please. And you're far more conscious in these pictures of multiple reflections. That is that you're not quite sure what you're seeing. That is that's a picture taken entirely of reflection, and then there's a reflection behind that, and so on. Like in a hall of mirrors. Now I'm calling this the general group. The next, please. And the next. And the next. And you can see the business of manipulating the natural light. That is, the light is streaming in. And the next. Right. So those are the general pictures which you can compare with the original from 56. And then the 6 of the shed. It wasn't me that called it, the next piece called it a shed. But it was this phenomenon. We got the next one, please. Has been heavily worked over by art historians, and I've simply adopted. They say it was based on somebody's garden shed, but of course that's a classic. For an art historian, everything has to be based on something. You know, that and preferably already published. So I call it a shed to please them. And you see there, you see the inside of the shed in front of you. And the next, please. And you could see in there the shutters holding back the sun and being manipulated into the space. And this is original, and it worked marvelously well. I mean, melted into the sun. It was supposed to be a pond, but it didn't occur to me for 48 years that is what it was supposed to be. And you see the remake of the fragment. It's unbelievable. Next, please. And you know the shed repeating, as in a hall of mirrors. Next, please. That was Enrique Morales' favorite picture for some reason. Next, please. And the level of reflectivity you can see. See, because aluminium face ply is not mirror. You know, it's got a mirror in a way, the negative quality. You know, it is aluminium face ply is a material. It's not a reflection. You know, so that there's something special. Next, please. And the next, please. You see, they managed to repeat the offhandness of the original. You know, the split nails and not screws. You know, split wood. I mean, the whole a whole exhibition was funded on something like £300 for everybody, for 10 groups. Everything had to be borrowed, stolen, etc. Handmade, next week. And then that was a remake, an original, which is now in the Tate Gallery. Suddenly, things go from being, done over the kitchen sink to being in a gallery. Next, please. Next. And what do I call this group? Something like more shed. Next, please. Yes. That's actually a wonderful photo montage. Next, please. And then I love this. I love that, whatever that is. Thank you. Next, please. I mean, you can imagine the person doing the reconstruction, scanning the original picture, and then sending scouts out to dumps to find things similar. Next, please. But to repeat, the quality of the light in the room, which was real light, real sunlight, that we were able to control, is what gives you this extraordinary quality. It's a quality of light. I hate art galleries without light. Next, please. Next. And there you see the way it works. That is, the shutters have been slightly open, so the light is, in this shot, coming upwards. Next, please. And along the floor. Next, please. I have to repeat. Next, please. And at the front of the sheet. You saw that same shot in the original 56 show. Next, please. There, that's fantastic. Under the surrounding thing. Look at, I must say it's been a pleasure for me when I discovered I had 30 slides of this. And, one spends a morning dividing them into groups. Each of the slides seemed to me extremely interesting in this quality of light thing. Next, please. And the next, please. And there are the fragments with the echo of the fragment of the sound. Next, please. A repeat. And the next, please. I love the fish. It's extraordinary. Next, please. Next, please. And the next. And just series on the reflections themselves. Next, please. So you're never quite sure what you're looking at. It's a mystery. Next, please. Through the door with the reflect of the man in the box. Next, please. And you see the shed in reflection. in the ICA room next, please. We're almost at an end. Next. And the next. I mean, look at that. That's extraordinary. And the next. I think the last group is, and the next, called Rainbow. That is that you see the jumble of reflection shot over by a rainbow. You know, it's classic of how much luck there is in life. You know, that is, you arrive at 11 in the morning, say, you know, and the light just by chance is perfect for manipulation. Not planned. Next, please. And you have the place to yourself. What is by choice is having the place to yourself. You know, therefore you can observe carefully, and you're not interfered with by rotten people like you lot. Next, please. Look at that. Next, please. And a repeat of an earlier one with a rainbow in it. And the next. And the next. Now, this is in Berkeley, California. And you can see two of the things that I've been exposing. One is the entirely artificial life, and the other is how easily things slip into a banality. You know, that is you then see that would be the same as you're the only one who laughs in the audience. You know, the two people who occupy a room, you know, you say to somebody, well, why don't you stay here for the week? You know, when you come back, it's wonderful. You know, you have somebody else and say the same thing, and they've ruined the room. You know, the rebuilding it is a work of art in itself. Next, please. Is the last one? No. Can we have? I can have the lights on when you absorb this for 2 seconds. All right. Thank you. The conscious observation that I've made of the rebuilding is that it's not exactly, it cannot be exactly the same, you know, because, and it can be made to work, you know, whereas when they, in the 60s, they talked about rebuilding the Barcelona Pavilion, and they wrote round, you know, and said, would you approve? And we replied, rebuilding the Barcelona Pavilion is a disaster, you know, because you destroy the, you know, it's like saying, you know, would you like a mock-up of Marilyn Monroe? It doesn't, it's not the same. But, therefore, we were very timid about saying okay to rebuild this thing. But the love that was, you know, that was brought to it, I think, that made it work. And what I've learned from it is that the business of lighting the floor. And I will now bring Enrique Morales back into the discussion. That when he was teaching at Frankfurt, somewhere in Germany, the students were set the problem of reuse of an existing brewery, with an absolutely massive brick building without any use anymore. How to bring them back into. And one of the things that I think was suggested was that one of the biggish rooms, say twice as big as this, should be used as a dance studio. And it suddenly occurred to me the obvious thing that you had to change the way the light entered the room, because the original function was the machinery of brewing. And of course, I now recognize retrospectively that it was a lesson learned in this rebuild. That is that you light the floor. Here the argument was light the floor and you behave like a student. You put books down, you sit on the floor, you work on the floor. Because you change if you work on a bench, you want the light at this level. I'm sorry to be so obvious, but you could say it took me from 1956 to 1990 to discover how important the lighting of the floor could be. So could I have that slide off? That's it's Axel Bruckhauser's bedroom in Germany. Yes, the only thing I should add is that in the English translation of the As Found catalogue, there's an essay by the director of the gallery in Zurich in which he explains the nature of the word as found. It's not meant that you've just found it. It's the business of the reflection on what you found. And of course, I think that the second rebuilding, which of course they didn't show, is a perfect example. That is, you would take the original 50s concept. The light makes you think it through again. What has happened? And of course, it was done in a period long before artists made physical arrangement, rooms and so on. It was spontaneous. And I suppose that's the last bit, was the pleasures of working with people to whom you don't have to talk. Each of you does it. And these collaborative things are entirely dependent on friendship. And you think back in the period we only know about through art history. These friendships before the First War in Russia and after the First War in France, between spontaneous combustions of the art phenomenon. And unless you find the right people, you're not going to get any fire. That's it. Oh, yes. But only 3.
Don't go away, don't go away. Peter, you can't answer the questions with your back to the audience. I know you don't have much faith in us. I'm sure that Peter will answer some questions. He's all mic'd up there. But you can also come and sit this way. We'll move a chair. You want to sit down. Come and sit here.
Yeah. Help me by translating the question.
I think Peter has made it deliberately short and sweet so that there is a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, I normally dislike questions. For the reason that what I normally talk about is how one works from what you've just done, erecting a little hypothesis that you can talk about, which is what you're going to do next. And of course, there's no question, because the hypothesis has to be proven by you, or disproven by work from the questioner, other than questions of fact, like why was Eduardo Palazzi so fat? I can answer that kind of question. Now we're going to have another lecture now.
Part 2.
There's a very nice book just being published about Nigel Henderson, in which there's a personal history of most of the people I'm talking about.
Actually, that exhibition is coming to the AA next
From
term.
Thames on Hudson. Price £21.95.
Can I ask you a question?
No, if that hasn't silenced.
Can I ask you a question? Is that all right?
Yeah.
I'll promise to do it in English. It seems, though, that the way that you made the presentation, that the discoveries, the as found of light, was something that when you started taking the photographs, also that became more and more highlighted. At least that's how your comments came across.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering why you, given the fact that you might not have known about this thing of the light, because you discovered it, maybe to a certain degree, why did you agree to the Reconstruction in 1990? Because it seems that that's sort of against the whole basis of your 300 pounds and the as found, because once you redo the as found as the as found of as found, it's a bit strange.
I don't actually consciously remember, except that when the Barcelona people wrote around asking whether they should do it, Mies van der Rohe said yes. Therefore, who
am I to say no?
Why should I? I argue with the architect, but he was not to know. I mean, the original Barcelona Pavilion was a timber roof with joists like that. It was rebuilt with concrete and waterproofing and all that. That is, the building was different, like this thing, changed because of the light. The Barcelona Pavilion changed because of the resonance, in my view. You know, that is, you don't. I mean, you probably saw the Sir John Soane exhibition, you know, where you rebuild the vaults in different materials, you fill them with junk. You don't get a Soane vault, you know. You get a not a simulacrum. Well, you get the kind of Jane Mansfield look-alike. None of you know who Jane Mansfield is.
You'll be surprised. But in fact, even with the Barcelona Pavilion, it's like your photographs. It's the photographs that people
it's the
know,
photograph.
and it's really the status of the photograph that becomes key. Because even the light, it's how you capture it with the photograph that
And of
becomes
course,
key.
the more they expose, you know, they find air photographs of what it was really like. You know, you can destroy it in another way by providing too much information. You know, I mean,
Can you say a little bit about what the original Patio and the Pavilion was actually about? Because I'm sure a lot of people know, but it would be quite useful if you said a little bit about the original content of that. You didn't spend a lot of time describing that.
yes, you know, you never know where all these things went to. You know, when there was all the mythology in the 50s, where did the marble from the Barcelona Pavilion go to? You know? We have discovered it in crates in Dusseldorf, you know, and Mies, of course, said it had been made into ashtray, you know. I mean, that is the mythology of a thing that's gone. I suppose it's like, you know, Waterloo. I mean, that is, who knows? What the battle was like. That's enough.
I guess that's the end. Thank you very much. Come back again to see part 2 on Friday the 2nd of November, all day.
Yes, yes, yes.